Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating and, well, let's be honest, intensely debated period.
Yeah, definitely.
We're talking about those, what, roughly 4 months in early 2025 when Elon Musk was put in charge of this new government body, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, as it quickly got nicknamed.
Right, DOGE. Appointed by President Trump, and Musk's mission was, well, ambitious is maybe putting it mildly, audacious perhaps.
That's maybe. He was basically tasked with auditing federal operations, finding all the inefficiencies, and then implementing some really aggressive, fast cost-cutting measures. Across the board, really.
Yeah, across the whole sprawling landscape of federal agencies. A huge undertaking.
And for this deep dive, our source material gives us a pretty good window into that whirlwind time, January to May 2025, basically. We've got DOGE's own public claims, some official reports, but also, crucially, a stack of independent analyses and audits.
And that's key, right? The goal here is to try and cut through some of the noise. We want to understand what DOGE claimed it found and saved versus how that stacks up against what these independent evaluations actually, verified.
Exactly. What was the real financial impact of this pretty brief tenure? Because the core of this story, laid out in these sources, it really is a stark contrast. You've got these huge headline-grabbing targets and announced savings.
Billions, even trillions thrown around.
Right. And then you have the independent auditors who looked at the books, looked at the actions, and found a dramatically different financial picture. So let's jump in. How did DOGE actually get started?
Okay, so setting the stage. The Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, it was created specifically with this mandate: find waste, eliminate it, enforce efficiency, and fundamentally cut federal spending significantly. And Musk was given pretty broad authority to go after that goal.
And his method, it wasn't about like small adjustments, was it? It was a really sweeping approach from day one.
Oh, absolutely. We saw these major initiatives rolled out super quickly. Things like terminating or suspending hundreds, maybe thousands of government contracts, proposing budget cuts so massive they frankly sounded like they could, gut entire programs or agencies.
And then there was that workforce plan, right? The fork in the road,
Yes, exactly. That whole plan targeting the federal workforce for reductions.
which pretty much immediately brought up some major points of contention, didn't it? The sources highlight this quite a bit.
They do. DOGE operated with, well, unusual autonomy and, maybe more importantly, a significant lack of transparency compared to what you'd normally expect from a government body.
How so?
Well, there was a court order, actually, that initially exempted DOGE from standard public disclosure rules like FOIA requests. This kind of opacity, it fueled a lot of legal challenges right away and a ton of criticism about how they were operating and, crucially, how they were counting their supposed savings.
Yeah, that opacity. It feels like a recurring theme when you get into the numbers. And that's where this whole story gets really, really complex. Musk started out with these just incredibly ambitious targets. What was it, $2 trillion initially?
That's right, $2 trillion, which he then scaled back slightly to $1 trillion. Still, astronomical figures.
And DOGE's public claims about the savings they were achieving, they kept changing, evolving rapidly over those 4 months.
They did. But when you put those claims side by side with the independent findings that are presented in these sources we looked at, the picture changes. Quite dramatically, actually.
Okay, let's try and track that timeline based on what the sources detail. So February 2025, DOGE comes out and announces initial savings of, what, $55 billion?
$55 billion, yes. And that included about $8.5 billion they claimed came from canceling or terminating contracts and leases.
Right. But almost immediately, there were questions.
Yeah, pretty much straight away. An NPR audit, and they were reviewing DOGE's own provided numbers. They found the figures just don't add up. They could only confirm about $2 billion in actual, realized savings from contracts that were genuinely canceled, not the $8.5 billion DOGE was claiming.
Only $2 billion out of $8.5 billion claims. It's a huge difference.
It is. And here's a standout detail from that NPR report, kind of highlights the issue. There was a massive typo in one of the contracts listed by DOGE, an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement ICE contract.
A typo.
Yeah. $8 million was mistakenly cited as $8 billion, with a B.
Wow.
So that single typo initially inflated DOGE's claimed savings tally by, well, almost $8 billion right there.
An $8 billion tax. Okay, that gives you a sense of the potential fragility of those early numbers.
Right.
So moving on. April 2025, DOGE's cumulative claimed savings figure jumps up to $160 billion.
Right. And this is where another independent analysis comes in, offering a really crucial counterpoint. It's from the Partnership for Public Service, PPS. They're a nonprofit focused on government effectiveness.
What did they find?
Well, they estimated that the chaos and the disruption caused by DOG's own actions, things like the workforce upheaval, the contract freezes, that disruption was actually costing taxpayers around $135 billion just in fiscal year 2025 alone.
Wait, hang on. So DOGE is claiming they've saved $160 billion by April.
Mm-hmm.
But this independent group looks at the operational impact, like paying tens of thousands of federal employees who were put on leave but still getting paid, the churn of firing people, then maybe having to rehire them, and they estimate that disruption itself cost the government $135 billion.
That's exactly what the PPS analysis, which is cited in our sources, found. It's basically saying the turmoil created by DOG's methods was incredibly expensive, almost wiping out the claim savings figure just in terms of internal operational costs.
That's staggering. And did that $135 billion cost estimate include everything?
No, and KPS is clear about that. They note that figure doesn't even include the potentially significant legal expenses the government incurred fighting all those lawsuits against DOGE's actions in court. Or, critically, any potential lost revenue from things like, say, reduced IRS enforcement if their budget got slashed.
Okay, so the plot thickens. Then we get to May 2025. Musk's role is about to transition, and the annual savings target gets quietly scaled back again.
Yeah, down again, this time to $150 billion for the year. And by this point, you have more independent experts weighing in, looking at the data that was available.
Like who?
Well, David Walker, for instance, he's the former U.S. Comptroller General, used to head up the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. He's quoted saying DOGE way overpromised. His estimate, based on what he could see, was that the actual realized savings were probably only about 1/10 to 1/5 of what DOGE was claiming around then.
So if DOGE claimed roughly $170 billion cumulative by then, Walker thought the reality was maybe $17 to $34 billion.
Exactly, somewhere in that range. Much, much lower. And the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, did an analysis around the same time. They mirrored that skepticism, finding the $150 billion annual claim optimistic. They noted only about $63 billion of the itemized cuts DOGE listed even had any documentation behind them. And even within that $63 billion, many items looked inflated or just plain erroneous.
Okay. And then the final public number from DOGE itself comes out around June 2025, right, as Musk is leaving that formal role.
Correct. DOGE put up this online record. They called it their wall of receipts, listing a purported $180 billion in identified savings.
$180 billion. That's the big final number they advertised. But that got scrutinized, too.
Oh, yeah, heavily. Multiple media outlets and watchdog groups mentioned in the sources, PolitiFact, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, they all dug into that $180 billion figure, and they consistently found major flaws in how it was calculated.
Like what kind of flaws?
Well, double counting cuts was a big one. Sometimes the same cut seemed to appear in different categories. Another issue was listing savings from actions that were proposed but simply hadn't been implemented yet, or maybe couldn't be implemented legally.
So aspirational savings being counted as actual savings.
Pretty much. And maybe the most striking finding from these audits, when you look at the bigger picture, is this. Total federal spending in 2025. It actually increased.
Despite DOGE claiming $180 billion in cuts.
It went up by about $135 billion year over year compared to 2024, which, interestingly, is roughly the same amount as that PPS estimate for the cost of DOGE's disruption.
Wow. So the net effect?
The analyses cited in the sources concluded there was basically no discernible net shrinkage of government spending during this period. So while DOGE was pointing to these huge numbers, the independent evaluations consistently found far, far less in realized immediate savings actually hitting the government's bottom line.
What explains that massive gap between the claimed $180 billion and what the auditors found and the fact spending went up?
Well, the sources point to a few key things. First, a lot of what DOGE called savings were really projected cuts or theoretical future reductions, not money saved from the current year's budget outlays.
So saving money 5 years from now, not necessarily right now.
Kind of, yeah. And second, many of the specific cuts they touted just weren't executed or they couldn't be sustained legally. Remember that NPR audit back in February? They found over half the contracts DOGE listed as terminated actually hadn't been terminated when they checked.
It really seems like there was a huge difference between, identifying something on a spreadsheet somewhere and actually making that cut happen in the real world of government bureaucracy and spending rules.
Absolutely. That's a really good way to put it. It highlights just how difficult it is to translate potential savings into actual concrete budget reductions, especially quickly.
Okay, so let's dig into some of those specific measures DOGE took. What were their targets, and what was the real-world impact according to these sources? They seem to go after a pretty wide range of agencies.
They did. But a major, major focus was definitely the federal workforce. DOGE aimed for the termination or the early retirement of tens of thousands of employees. That's where the Fork in the Road program came in.
That was the one offering a deferred resignation package,
Yeah,
right? Like, agree to leave later, but maybe stay on the payroll for a while without actually working.
that's the one. The sources indicate the target was something like 130,000 federal positions to be eliminated. Huge number.
But did they actually achieve that?
Not even close, according to the sources. Because of swift legal challenges from unions and others and subsequent court orders, the actual net reduction in the federal workforce was far, far smaller. Estimates put it at only around 12,000 to maybe 20,000 employees, which sounds like a lot, but it's roughly just 1% of the total federal workforce.
Well, the 1% net reduction after targeting 130,000 positions.
Yeah, and a really major blow to any claimed savings from workforce cuts came when the courts ordered the rehiring of 24,000 employees.
Rehiring. Why?
They were found to have been fired improperly, likely violating civil service laws or procedures, and the government was ordered to give them back pay for the time they were out.
Getting rehired with back pay. Well, that definitely cancels out any immediate savings from firing them in the first place, doesn't it?
Completely undercuts it. The sources argue pretty strongly that this chaotic, legally fraught approach to workforce reduction actually cost money in the short term. You had salary costs continuing for people on leave or mandated back pay, while positions were maybe left unfilled, disrupting services, or they had to go through costly rehiring processes later, not exactly efficient.
Okay, so the workforce piece was complicated. What about canceling or freezing contracts and grants? That was another big part of their strategy.
Yes, absolutely. High-profile targets mentioned in the sources included things like significant grants for state public health programs, scientific research funding. DOGE also took actions that seemed aimed at effectively defunding certain agencies.
Like which ones?
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, was one, and they moved to almost entirely shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAI, which handles foreign aid. Budget experts quoted in the sources observed that many of these specific cuts seem to align more with, shall we say, particular political priorities rather than just a neutral, across-the-board search for inefficiency.
Right. And DOGE's own wall of receipts for these contract actions listed about $8.5 billion after they corrected that big typo. But you mentioned audits found issues with that number, too.
They did. Auditors found numerous errors and, well, questionable accounting in that list. For example, sometimes they'd count the maximum potential value of a multi-year contract as an instant saving right now.
Even if the money wouldn't have been spent for years.
Exactly. Or they'd list unused contract options, money the government could have spent but chose not to, as if actively cutting that option was a new saving. Little things like that added up.
So what was the real number for contract savings?
Well, re-emphasizing that NPR calculation from February, they found only about $2 billion in actual spending was reduced via contract terminations that had definitely happened by then. And just over half of that $2 billion came from specific agencies like Education, the CFPB, and USAID, the ones that seem to be political targets.
Okay. What about the claims about uncovering massive fraud and waste? That was a big part of Musk's rhetoric, wasn't it? Finding billions in hidden fraud.
It absolutely was. He spoke frequently about uncovering widespread, previously unknown fraud that would yield these huge savings. But the sources we reviewed are pretty consistent on this point. Little hard evidence of new fraud recoveries emerged during his 4 months.
Really, despite the claims.
Yeah. Journalists and watchdog groups who looked into it found that many of the specific claims DOGE made about uncovering fraud have not held up under scrutiny. It seems much of the waste that DOGE highlighted. Well, it had actually already been identified by existing government oversight bodies, like the GAO or the inspectors general within each agency. They already knew about a lot of this stuff.
So it was more like DOGE was highlighting existing known issues rather than busting open huge new fraud rings.
That seems to be the main conclusion drawn by the sources. There was one modest positive outcome noted by the GAO's Controller General, Gene Dodaro. He did acknowledge that DOG's push maybe helped open up data barriers between agencies,
Meaning?
making it a bit easier for different parts of the government to share data, which could help detect improper payments, like sending money to the wrong person or for the wrong amount. But he framed it as an incremental improvement in data sharing, not some major new fraud bust credited to DOGE. No big recoveries were linked directly to their work in that period.
Okay, so we've talked about the claim savings, what was actually cut, what wasn't, the fraud piece. Now let's flip the coin and talk about the costs incurred by DOGE's efforts. Because the sources suggest this picture is way more complex than just adding up potential cuts.
This is absolutely critical to understanding the full impact, yes. Remember that Partnership for Public Service Analysis we mentioned?
The one that estimated DOGE's disruption cost $135 billion.
Exactly. They calculated that the sheer disruption and the operational costs created by DOGE, things like paying, again, tens of thousands of employees who were essentially sidelined but still on payroll, the costs of the hiring and rehiring churn, the lost productivity as agencies just tried to deal with the upheaval, all that cost the government around $135 billion in that single fiscal year, mostly in wasted salary payments and lost output.
$135 billion in wasted salary and lost productivity.
Yeah.
In just 1 year. I mean, that sounds like the literal opposite of government efficiency.
It is, according to the source's analysis. And that staggering $135 billion figure, again, doesn't even capture other significant costs, like the substantial legal fees the government had to spend defending DOGE's actions against all those lawsuits.
Well, lawsuits, they were immediate and widespread, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Employee unions, other groups, they filed suits almost immediately. They argued DOGE simply lacked the legal authority for many of its mass actions, particularly around personnel, and the courts often agreed, issuing injunctions, most notably ordering the rehiring of those 24,000 employees.
With back pay.
With back pay, found to have been improperly fired. That's a direct cost-negating savings right there.
And what about DOGE being exempt from transparency laws? That court stay helped them operate quickly, but it caused issues too.
It did. While it limited immediate public and congressional oversight, it also raised huge concerns precisely because of that lack of transparency. By March 2025, you had bipartisan members of the House formally requesting the GAO, Congress's watchdog, to conduct a full audit of DOGE's activities.
What did they want GAO to look into specifically?
They asked GAO to examine DOGE's impact on agencies like Homeland Security, and specifically whether federal civil service laws had been violated by the mass firings and other personnel actions. There was real concern about the legality of what DOGE was doing.
And the sources seem to suggest that many of DOGE's unilateral actions might ultimately be ruled unlawful anyway, or at least require Congress to approve them.
That's the strong suggestion, yes. The federal government is just a really complex system. You generally can't just have one executive entity make sweeping changes by decree, especially changes impacting personnel roles or programs established by law. Those things often run up against existing statutes and usually require congressional action to be made permanent or even legal in the first place. Many of DOGE's moves looked vulnerable on those grounds.
Okay, now one of the most contentious specific actions DOGE took, highlighted quite a bit in the sources, was the plan for massive cuts to the IRS.
Yes, that was hugely controversial. DOGE targeted the Internal Revenue Service for a really dramatic downsizing. The proposal was to cut roughly 40% of its staff. The apparent view is that IRS enforcement activities were somehow inefficient spending.
Cut 40% of the IRS. And what did the sources say about the potential financial fallout from that specific proposed cut?
Well, it was projected to be enormous, but not in a good way for the government's finances. A Yale Budget Lab study, cited in the sources, estimated that slashing IRS staff like that would forfeit around $323 billion in uncollected taxes over the next decade.
Forfeit $323 billion, because there wouldn't be enough staff to conduct audits and enforcement.
Precisely. Money the IRS would otherwise have collected. And the IRS itself reportedly warned internally that the kind of staff reductions DOGE was pushing could lead to up to a 10% drop in annual revenue collection.
A 10% drop in annual tax revenue. That's huge.
Yeah.
How much money are we talking about?
Potentially over $500 billion lost per year in future tax collections, based on those internal warnings cited.
Okay, let me get this straight. The plan was to cut the IRS budget, save maybe some billions on salaries over time.
Right. The direct payroll savings were estimated at about $38 billion over 10 years.
Okay, $38 billion saved on payroll. But the potential lost revenue from not collecting taxes could be over $300 billion over a decade, or maybe even $500 billion a year.
That's what the sources indicate, yeah. As they emphasize, the scale of those potential revenue losses from gutting tax enforcement absolutely dwarfs the direct budget savings from the payroll cuts. It completely undermines any claim that this specific action would be a net fiscal benefit for the government.
Wow. It really underscores that cutting government isn't always simple, is it? Reducing headcounts in one area can have massive indirect financial costs elsewhere.
Exactly. And the sources offer other examples of this dynamic, where cuts had ripple effects or weren't straightforward savings at all.
Like what else?
Well, cuts to PEPFAR, that's the big global AIDS relief program, they were heavily criticized by public health experts. The argument was that for relatively small budget savings, these cuts could literally cost lives and reverse years of hard-won progress against a global health crisis. That's a cost, even if it's not purely financial.
Right, a human cost.
And another example, at the Department of Agriculture, the USDA. Scientists who specialized in bird flu were apparently among the staff laid off due to DOGE-instigated reductions. Then, wouldn't you know it, significant bird flu outbreaks occurred shortly after.
Oh, no.
And they had to hastily rehire some of those same scientists. It just demonstrated that eliminating expertise isn't always a saving. It can have immediate, dangerous consequences and end up costing money to fix the problem you created.
So it sounds like some of these cuts weren't really net savings at all. They were more like, I don't know, cost deferrals or just shifting expenses around, or they resulted in lost value, like public health crises not being prevented as effectively.
That seems to be a key takeaway from the sources, yes. They highlight critiques suggesting some of DOG's actions felt driven more by political ideology than frugality, or maybe lacked a careful, holistic calculation of all the costs and benefits involved.
Okay, so with all this back and forth, the huge claims versus the critical findings, the potential costs versus the supposed savings, have any official government oversight bodies like OMB or GAO published a final definitive audit, like a net score for DOGE's financial impact?
According to the sources we have, no. No formal government audit specifically calculating DOGE's net savings, meaning, identified savings minus all the costs incurred, has been published yet. But both the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the Government Accountability Office, GAO, have weighed in with their perspectives.
Okay, what was the view from OMB? That's the executive branch's budget office, led then by Russell Vought.
OMB, generally speaking, defended DOGE's mission and its basic intent. Vought did acknowledge in testimony that some of the cost savings claims circulating around DOGE were, in his words, misleading or wholly inaccurate. But he also thanked Musk's team for highlighting examples of waste within the government bureaucracy.
So acknowledging the numbers might be off, but appreciating the effort.
Kind of. OMB's stated focus now, according to the sources, is to try and institutionalize DOGE's work, basically. Take any useful findings or methods and integrate them into existing agency processes. The White House even requested $45 million in the following year's budget proposal to continue funding some DOGE staff into 2026.
Interesting. So an intent to continue some form of this work. But OMB didn't release their own independent figure for verified savings achieved during Musk's actual 4-month tenure.
No, they did not provide such a figure. President Trump cited some anecdotal examples of successes, but the sources note that some of those examples, like efforts to modernize federal retirement systems, actually predated DOG's creation entirely.
Okay, so what about the GAO, Congress's nonpartisan watchdog? How did they view DOGE's efforts?
Well, the Comptroller General, Gene Dodaro, noted that initially DOGE barely had any contact with GAO's experts, which he found unusual for a body supposedly focused on government efficiency, since GAO does this stuff all the time.
Yeah, you'd think they'd talk to the government's main efficiency experts.
Right. However, Dodaro reported that by May 2025, towards the end of Musk's tenure, DOGE was actually using our recommendations to some extent, so maybe some limited coordination developed later on.
And GAO itself, they already have a pretty good handle on where potential savings are, right?
Oh, absolutely. The GAO has a long, long history of identifying government waste and inefficiency through detailed audits. Their own 2025 report, released around that time, outlined about $100 billion in achievable cost reductions just from reducing duplication between programs and implementing known best practices. They have roadmaps for this stuff.
So the GAO already had a plan for $100 billion in savings based on their methodical work.
Precisely. And Dodaro, while acknowledging that DOGE might have had some marginal positive outcomes, like maybe helping break down some of those data silos for improper payment detection.
The incremental thing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. He stressed these were small steps, not the massive sweeping savings DOGE claimed. And the GAO's consistent perspective, shared by many budget experts cited in the sources, is that if you really want major, enduring deficit reduction, you need Congress to act.
Meaning?
Meaning changes to the big mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or significant changes to tax law, those are the huge drivers of the budget. Things that DOGE's unilateral executive actions simply couldn't touch on their own.
Right, they were focused on discretionary spending and agency operations, not the big entitlements or tax code.
Exactly. And the sources draw a pretty clear contrast there between the GAO's long-term, painstaking approach and DOGE's very short-term, disruptive one.
How so?
Well, the GAO has documented over $725 billion in financial benefits, real savings achieved over the last 15 years just from implementing their recommendations across different administrations, Republican and Democrat. That sheer scale underscores that achieving real, lasting fiscal benefits usually comes from detailed program-by-program work, cooperation between agencies and Congress, often over many years.
Which is pretty much the opposite of DOGE's rapid, top-down, 4-month blitz.
It really is. As one expert cited in the sources colorfully put it, comparing the two, GAO is the pro football team, and Musk's DOGE is a pickup team, trying to do the same complex job. It just highlights the difference in scale, established process, expertise, and, frankly, proven results over time.
That's a great analogy. Really puts it in perspective. Okay, so pulling all these threads together now from all this source material we've been discussing, what is the overall kind of bottom line net financial impact of Elon Musk's brief time leading DOGE?
Well, based on all the independent analyses and audits reviewed in these sources, the overall financial impact looks, at best, mixed, and certainly heavily, heavily debated. DOGE, as we said, claimed they identified up to $180 billion in potential savings by rooting out waste. That was their headline number.
But the actual verified immediate savings realized during that period were much, much smaller.
Significantly smaller, yes. Likely only on the order of tens of billions of dollars at the very most, once independent auditors accounted for all the errors, the reversals of actions like the firings, and the many cuts that simply weren't implemented or couldn't be legally sustained.
And crucially, on top of those limited savings, there were substantial costs incurred because of DOGE's actions.
Exactly. You had billions paid to employees who were effectively doing nothing while on administrative leave. Considerable costs tied to the legal challenges and the court-mandated rehiring with back pay, and then the potentially massive future cost of hundreds of billions in lost tax revenue from those deep cuts proposed for the IRS.
And the final piece. The sources conclude that despite all this activity focused on cutting, overall federal spending didn't actually decrease during this period.
Correct. That's a key finding. Total federal expenditures actually increased year over year in 2025 compared to 2024. Didn't go down, it went up.
So if you put it all together, the claimed savings largely not materializing immediately, plus the significant costs of disruption and lost revenue, what's the likely net outcome, according to these independent analyses?
The sources strongly suggest that in the absence of a formal government audit calculating the precise net impact, the most reliable estimates available indicate that Musk's DOGE may have ultimately cost the government more money than it saved during its brief existence.
Costs more than it saved.
That seems to be the conclusion when you consider all the factors presented in these sources. The limited verified savings, the high operational disruption costs, the legal fees, the potentially huge lost revenue down the line. Any potential long-term efficiencies that might have been initiated by DOGE during this period are purely speculative at this point and would take years to materialize and verify, if they ever do.
So despite the enormous numbers advertised initially, the immediate financial outcome for the U.S. government's fiscal health wasn't the dramatic improvement that perhaps proponents had hoped for or expected.
That appears to be the consistent finding from the independent audits and analyses that make up our source material for this deep dive, yes.
It really is a remarkable case study, isn't it? In the sheer difficulty of trying to implement rapid, top-down disruptive change within a system as vast, complex, and frankly resistant to sudden shifts as the U.S. federal government.
Absolutely.
While DOGE certainly succeeded in maybe shining a harsh spotlight on the persistent issue of government waste and inefficiency, and perhaps it rallied some political support for the idea of reform.
It definitely got people talking.
Yeah. But the immediate financial results, as reported by these independent sources, seem to have fallen far, far short of the ambitious claims made at the time.
The whole experience really does illustrate the profound challenges involved in achieving quick, sweeping budgetary wins in Washington. It's just not that easy.
And it kind of suggests, doesn't it, that finding and implementing enduring real cost reduction often relies less on these high-speed unilateral executive actions, and maybe more on that painstaking, detailed, sometimes unglamorous work across agencies. Plus, the necessary cooperation and legislative changes from Congress to actually make significant, lasting impacts on the federal budget. It just highlights how incredibly hard it is to genuinely move the needle on government spending, especially in just a 4-month time frame.